I'm Mavusum Simang. I previously worked as the Chief Executive Officer at South African National Parks for about 7 years. More recently, the Minister of Environmental Affairs requested me to get together a group of stakeholders, Rhino stakeholders, to discuss possibilities of saving the rhino in the face of an escalation in poaching.
Is the principle of sustainable use of wildlife resources a newfangled, untested concept that has no place in African wildlife conservation? Is strict militant protectionism the only policy that can work, or are there alternatives? Should rural indigenous communities living with wildlife be allowed to benefit from the resource? Do trade bans work? How do we avoid catapulting a species into the abyss of extinction? Granite cave walls dappled with ancient rock paintings tell of an African genesis teeming with wildlife, hunted yet greatly revered by these, the San people. African tribal folklore from across the continent is infused with tales of man and beast and the significance of the relationship. Nature provided, but was also respected. Little changed over the centuries as the cycles of drought and abundance alternated, until, inexorably, the outside world closed in. Empire building, coupled with the insatiable demand for slaves, gold, ivory, and rhino horn, reshaped the continent's destiny. Respect for nature's bounty crumbled as the African people were forced to mortgage their heritage. In the early 1800s, before European exploration penetrated the more remote parts of Africa, black rhino were thought to number between 500,000 and 1 million. The white rhino population was estimated to be around 100,000 to 250,000. Both species were widespread south of the Sahara, outside of the tropical rainforests. Captain William Cornwallis Harris, one of the first Europeans to explore southern Africa, wrote in the 1830s that he had met with the white rhinoceros in almost incredible numbers. In the 1870s, the famous hunter and explorer Frederick Courtenay-Selous thought that the white rhino in the northwest of the Transvaal had increased almost to the limit of its food supply. Some 40 years later, he noted that hunting had driven the white rhino to the brink of extinction. Technical improvements to firearms in the 19th century made hunting easier. The modern rifles could shoot further and were more accurate than ever before. Big game animals became easy targets, the docile white rhino especially so, as it could be approached with little danger. Hunters and traders supplied free guns and ammunition to native Africans for the sole purpose of rhino slaughter. The horn sold well in Europe for the use in decorative carvings, sword hilts, as well as butt plates and hand grips for the more expensive rifles and pistols. In the East, rhino horn was used for medicinal purposes, a 2,000-year-old tradition. By 1900, there were only 50 to 100 white rhinos left in South Africa. This ruthless plunder was untenable, and in May of 1900, the colonial powers initiated a regional convention to try and safeguard the natural resources of the African continent. That agreement was never ratified, but in 1933, a revised resolution to include plant species was adopted. The resolution's ideals were noble and essential. Under the circumstances, there appeared to be no other choice. A concept of wilderness parks and reserves inviolate and free of human interference for the purpose of preserving wildlife and habitats for future generations. Structured administration of natural resources did appear to slow the bloodshed, but it was impossible for the architects of the convention to foresee that the policy would ultimately be incompatible with an alienated, rapidly expanding indigenous human population. The very people who had coexisted with and depended upon the wildlife resource were now denied any real benefit from it. the sustainable utilization model that had prevailed for centuries before the carnage succumbed to a new, foreign, idealistic wildlife philosophy: protectionism. Across the continent, wildlife reserves were proclaimed and demarcated with scant regard to the plight of the indigenous people who lived in and around these new parks. The wildlife now belonged to the all-powerful state. Whilst these sanctuaries were secured to a degree, the system fomented a festering hatred for both the authorities and the wildlife within the reserves. The only interaction now was that of conflict, crop-raiding elephant and stock-killing predators. Traditional hunting, an age-old cultural practice and means of survival, was reclassified as poaching. In order to implement this repressive doctrine, it was inevitable that wildlife and people would have to be separated, in many instances with fences. The intimate relationship between the indigenous people and wildlife was shattered. Despite the creation of these sanctuaries, by the end of the 1950s, wildlife in southern Africa was in serious decline. State-enforced protectionism as a policy had failed. But what were the fundamental reasons for its failure? In part, it was due to an arrogant lack of sensitivity to the needs of the indigenous people, an inability to recognize that people and wildlife share the same habitats, an absence of economic incentive to conserve wildlife, and too much faith was placed in the effectiveness of the law, irrespective of whether it was acceptable, unbiased, enforceable, or even functional.
What we've done is we've taken away in the colonial period and also the post-colonial period, we've basically taken away the rights of people to live with the wildlife. Those were their livelihoods. So we as colonial white people from Europe and America have made traditional lifestyles illegal. We are now bearing the cost of that, in that local people don't value wildlife anymore. I started my career as an extension officer working on private land in Zimbabwe. When I first started working, everybody was farming cattle. The reason people were doing that is that wildlife had no value. So we changed the legislation. We gave the ownership of wildlife to the farmers, and we also encouraged them to use it through meat production, safari hunting, products, and so on. And within 10 years, the vast majority of cattle ranchers, people who said they were culturally cattle ranchers, had switched to wildlife. And they were making 2 to 4 times as much profit from the land, and also allowing the biodiversity to recover. Better water, better soil, better trees, better grass, and so on.
In South Africa, provincial legislation was changed to allow ownership of wildlife within certain conditions and technical specifications.
I spent 13 years as the CEO of Nature Conservation in the province of Natal and subsequently KwaZulu-Natal. Throughout my career, I've been associated with the Natal Parks Board. Our basic philosophy was that wildlife should not just be the purview of a nature conservation agency. We started as an organization back in the early 70s with a policy of persuading farmers who were relatively hostile to nature conservation in those days that wildlife had a role to play on their farms and in fact could be of great benefit to their farms for whatever reason, for aesthetic reasons, for exploitative reasons. We've given them ownership over the wildlife, and this policy has become entrenched in South Africa, and we have created probably the greatest wildlife industry the world has ever seen, based on sustainable use. We have far more large mammals in South Africa now than we had 200 years ago. We now have a massive ecotourism business for the purposes of sustainably using them, either aesthetically for photographic tourism or for hunting and for cropping. The biltong hunter in South Africa, the person who's not interested in a trophy but just likes meat, is of equal value to this country in terms of how our wildlife is sustainably used, as is the wealthiest Italian count that comes here to hunt for a special purpose to get a bigger and bigger animal.
While in southern Africa wildlife was being incentivized, Kenya was taking a dramatically opposite approach, using protectionism as the guiding wildlife philosophy.
So I look at land use economics, and I'm particularly interested in the economics of conservation, and especially the difference in economic returns to landowners from agricultural production, livestock production, and wildlife production. Now, I think Kenya shows a textbook example of what happens to a natural resource base when you remove its economic viability. 30 years ago, Kenya had a most extraordinary wildlife conservation policy, very, very broad-based, from strict protection in the national parks and reserves, right through to ranching and cropping and live capture and sales, and of course, including sport hunting. And there were all the value-added industries as well, the tanning, taxidermy, curios, all these sorts of things. And then in 1977, all consumptive use of wildlife was banned in Kenya, and the only use you could make of it was through tourism. Now, the extraordinary thing was, in 1977, when this dramatic change in conservation policy occurred, there was also set up something called the Kenya Rangeland Ecological Monitoring Unit, and I was involved with that. I was training all the aerial survey crews. And miraculously, from this major change in policy to today, we also had a way of monitoring the impact of the policy. And year by year by year, CREMU as it was called, it counted livestock and wildlife across all the rangelands of Kenya, the parks, the rangeland areas, the private lands. And year by year by year, we started to see that Kenya was hemorrhaging wildlife. The average rate over the last 35 years has been 4.5% per annum loss. We have now lost 80% of the wildlife that we had, say, 35 years ago. And many of us think that that is strongly correlated, not 100%, but strongly correlated with this reduction in the economic value of wildlife to landowners. South Africa went the other way, and in De Soto's terms, wildlife became fully fungible, just like livestock. You could trade them, you could buy them, you could sell them, you could eat them, you could do whatever you wanted with them. 35 years later, Kenya has lost 80% of its wildlife. In South Africa, from 1.5 million, whatever it was, there are now over 20 million head of wildlife, and increasing still. Here in Kenya, sadly, we've restricted the economic returns to wildlife, and we've seen wildlife go.
Ezemvelo KZM Wildlife has one of the proudest records of nature conservation in Africa. The organization's progressive policies have paid dividends over the years, and one of their greatest success stories has been that of the white rhino. Dr. Ian Player is considered to be one of the most influential driving forces behind Operation Rhino.
I have been involved in wildlife conservation and environmental protection for 62 years. In 1953, we did the very first aerial count of the white rhino, the Umfolozi Game Reserve, and there were 437. That population started to grow, and by the time I became the senior warden in charge of Umfolozi Game Reserve in 1958, the population had risen to over 600. And it was quite clear that because of the danger of cattle coming in with anthrax, that the rhino were in a serious position. If one diseased beast had got in amongst the cattle, that would have been the end of the white rhino. And that led me to initiate what ultimately became known as Operation Rhino. Our plan of action was clear right from the beginning. We wanted to, first of all, relocate the rhino and all their former habitats. And once we had got sufficient rhino out of Umfolozi, that we would then start to sell them overseas. In a very short space of time, we had delivered over 300 rhino outside of the country. But the population was still growing. And the board then eventually took the decision that the rhino would be made available for hunting. And ranchers were buying rhino at a very low cost and then selling them to overseas hunters, and that money was being reinvested back into the purchase of more land for wildlife and consequently the purchase of more rhino. So the rhino was a very important economic factor in the development of the game ranches. The rhino population, as a result of being put onto game ranches and carefully taken care of, with the few that were being shot by hunters, the rhino population exploded. And from that small population that Hendrik van Schoor and I counted in 1953, the population today has been estimated between 15 and 20,000. And there is no doubt in my mind that it is because of the fact that the hunters were brought in and that there was an economic incentive for game ranching.
And that, by the way, is the secret of our success in conserving the rhino. We should be given credit. We really ought to.
This radical concept of private rhino ownership was the engine that drove the establishment of game ranching in South Africa. The private landowner was able to profit from his investment through photographic and hunting safaris, as well as the selling of excess animals onto other game ranches. The transfer of ownership handed the private landowner the responsibility for the species' survival through protection from poaching and provision of suitable habitat. The rhino's range has been extended, and the burden as well as cost of rhino protection shifted from the government to the private sector. By auctioning off excess rhino from parks that are approaching maximum carrying capacity, the authorities are ensuring that breeding performance is not depressed through overpopulation. Money realized through the sale of these animals is plowed back into the organization for use in other conservation projects.
I am the Natural Resource Trade Coordinator for Ezimbelo KZN Wildlife. I've been employed here for over 16 years. My main area of responsibility is the sale of live game and hunting packages for the organization. Each year we do game census in each of the protected areas, and that's where the excess animals are determined. Once those figures have been approved by the Ezimbelo KZN Wildlife Board, we start capturing the animals at the beginning of the year and put them in bomas. The animals spend 4 to 6 weeks in the bomas before the sale. The animals that we're selling on this auction are basically excess to Ezimbelo's needs. We have to find homes for them, and the best way we can do that is by selling them off to potential game farmers. Hopefully they can breed, get new genes into their populations. It also brings in valuable revenue for Ezimbelo, which helps subsidize the operations.
They hobbied on them all at 340,000. The bid is right in front here. 340,000, all out and done again.
In the mid-1980s, it became apparent to the Zimbabwean wildlife authorities that the same model of wildlife ownership that had been implemented on private land could be applied to rural communities.
We realized that if white farmers could do it, what's the difference? Why can't black farmers do it? So we invented Campfire.
Campfire is the acronym for Communal Areas Management Program for Indigenous Resources, and is a strategy devised to satisfy the needs of rural communities whilst conserving the environment. Safari hunting is the best wildlife use option in communal areas. Game populations are generally too low to support photographic safari operations, but high enough to sustain controlled hunting. The bulk of the safari hunting opportunities in communal lands is for dangerous game, the majority of which are considered problem animals, that is, crop raiders such as elephant and livestock-killing predators.
When I started in Campfire, something like 300 or 400 elephants were being killed a year in communities for eating crops. Because, you know, living in a community, elephants are terrifying and they do a lot of damage. So in 1989, we introduced safari hunting to these areas. And we allowed the communities to set their own quotas. And as a consequence of that, roughly a reduction in the number of elephants killed every year from something like 400 to something like 120. So instead of using a lot of animals very badly, but by doing sustainable use properly, we use much fewer animals much better. And so we create sustainable development. And by sustainable development, I mean you produce more from less. You produce a lot of money from very few animals. Even in crowded Zimbabwe, you'll see that wildlife stopped declining and in some places started to recover. And you can see that idea spread across Southern Africa and in fact globally.
And the best example of that is probably from Namibia, where there are some 79 communal conservancies. And those communal conservancies in Namibia cover 19% of the land surface of the country. And the primary form of land use there is consumptive use of wildlife. Now take that away and close that down. Much of that land would revert to cattle or subsistence agriculture.
The sustainable use is building these massive buffer zones around protected areas, without which I don't think protected areas are going to survive without a lot of state subsidization in the region.
We must put this in perspective to look at how things are working in Africa. Every single national park and game reserve today, without exception, is underfunded. Just look at Kruger National Park, perhaps one of the best known national parks in Africa. 1 million visitors a year.
Currently in Kruger National Park, where you've got the largest holding of white rhino on earth, you have the army mobilized. They use drones. The rangers have been reinforced. Just about everything that you can think of is being thrown into the exercise of trying to protect the rhino from poachers.
Now, what does that say? That the way we're running things in Africa, with the money that we have that's generated from conservation, it's simply not doing the job that we want to get things right.
If we look globally, the biggest threat to wildlife is the expansion of domestic stock. 4% of the global zoo mass is now wildlife. So that means 96% is in domestic species. So why have domestic species increased? Domestic species have increased because they're owned by people and people are allowed to use them. What we've shown in Southern Africa is that when you can own wildlife and you can use it, it can come back. The biggest threat to wildlife is certainly not poaching, although poaching is visible. The biggest threat is replacement by other forms of land use. International governance that is starting to chip away at the value of wildlife is actually a very serious threat to the future of wildlife in Africa.
I'm Chief Director of Biodiversity Research at the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and I have also until recently been Chair of the Scientific Authority for South Africa, which deals in species conservation and particularly species in trade. I think what's really important to realize is that the principle of sustainable use is embedded in CITES and the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species. So every single country that's a member of CITES is supposed to have both a management authority that issue permits and a scientific authority. And the scientific authority's job is to look at the scientific evidence for sustainable use. So CITES terminology is what they call a non-detriment finding. So effectively what that is, a scientific authority has to say that trade in a particular species won't have a detriment to the populations. Anything that's listed on CITES, and there are over 30,000 species listed on CITES. If there's any trade in those species, the scientific authority has to say whether that trade is sustainable or not. And there's some really good examples worldwide of sustainable use that have been used within the CITES context. So you just have to look at crocodiles, for example.
The Nile crocodile had been virtually exterminated in Zimbabwe in the 1950s due to wholesale commercial skin hunting. The species was particularly vulnerable because of the restricted nature of their habitats, the cost-effectiveness of night hunting with a spotlight, and the high unit value per kill. Faced with this predicament, the wildlife authorities took a seemingly contrary approach to a solution. Permission was granted for the establishment of commercial crocodile ranches. The rationale behind this was, firstly, to undercut poaching by supplying skins from a legitimate source. Secondly, to secure numbers for restocking in suitable habitats. And thirdly, to give the species a tangible value so as to persuade people to tolerate the animal outside of protected areas. Assigning a commercial value to a scarce species, despite low numbers, proved to be far more effective in conserving the reptile than if a protectionist approach had been taken.
Zimbabwe joined CITES in about 1983, and what was unusual about Zimbabwe joining CITES was right at the outset, crocodiles were on Appendix 1 of CITES. So Zimbabwe took a reservation on entering CITES that it could not accept that Appendix 1 listing, and it stayed outside CITES as far as crocodiles went. The crocodile trade was developed in Zimbabwe to a very high level through crocodile farming. People often say to me, how did you manage to stop the illegal hunting? Well, once the supply of skin through legal conduits worked, there wasn't an incentive left for anybody to try and compete with this probably cheaper form of production of crocodile skin. And eventually the crocodile trade destroyed the illegal trade in crocodiles. And eventually CITES started recognizing ranching of species as a form of conservation. And today crocodiles are on Appendix 2 of CITES with quotas. The principles remain the same for very many wildlife products. If you make it easy for people to be legal, to trade legally, and don't put unnecessary hurdles in their way, you end up solving a lot of problems for yourself as an administrator or regulator.
So there's been a shift in CITES over the last couple of years to also recognizing the role of livelihood. So recognizing that conservation benefits when people on the ground who are looking after wildlife resources benefit from those resources. Somewhere that those people actually get an income and can have a livelihood around the wildlife that's on their property, then that wildlife tends to be looked after.
The group that has been left out of this whole conversation, this whole deal, has been tribal communities who live on communal land. And those communities have never been empowered to utilize the land and the resources upon that land in the manner in which the private sector has been able to do. Communities, particularly those communities adjacent to protected areas, are the ones who have experienced the greatest cost in the establishment of those protected areas, and who to this day do not benefit from those protected areas in any way whatsoever. And that land used to belong to them. It used to be their ancestors' land, and they get no benefit from it.
People should not take decisions and exclude the communities, and take decisions on behalf of communities without looking at the plight of the communities. And I mustn't think that communities do not understand this whole concept of conservation.
I work for Resource Africa. My name is Pamela Cele. Basically, we specialize in community-based natural resource management, where we try to bridge the gap between nature and the communities that depend on the nature. People and Parks is a program that we did in collaboration with the Department of Environmental Affairs, where we worked with protected areas around the country, going around teaching people of the importance of the parks and nature and the types of benefit they can get and so forth.
We're doing door-to-door, visiting schools, visiting clinics, and visiting the home-based care. Meeting all the people, explaining to the people how this rhino poaching impact to the people. Some of them, they are positive to assist us. But some of them, they're saying that when they do poaching, they do it because there are poverty in their house. The problem of unemployment is the thing that they make them to go and do poaching.
My experience from the People in Parks program that we ran for 3 years was that most of the parks that we went to, the communities were complaining about tangible benefits from the park. And we also know that there's a lot of damage-causing animals, and they had a lot of frustrations. So in terms of compensation and getting certain benefits from the parks.
When the lion come outside to the community people, they have a big complaint because they kill the livestock. So they doesn't get a composite. Lots of questions they ask, how can we save the rhino? Because they don't form a good relationship to us when they don't compensate us to our cattle when they killed by the lion, because the lion is for Kruger National Park.
Conservation is not only about animals, it's not only about plants, it's about human beings as well, especially those communities that live in areas that are adjacent to protected areas, because those are the communities that are very much impoverished. And from time to time, they keep on asking, what is in it for them in this whole thing that is called conservation? So I think the time has come for everybody to sit up and take notice that communities have got to be treated as part of conservation. Unless we can prove to the communities that it is important for these areas to be conserved because they can benefit from them, we might as well forget about expanding our protected areas. The only way in which communities would respect conservation and hold protected areas in high esteem would be when they can see that there are benefits for them from conservation.
I'm really convinced that with the right strategy, we can get the community on side, and they are a vital link in this war against poachers, or in the war for the saving of the rhino.
So how is it possible to include impoverished rural communities in meaningful and profitable wildlife conservation endeavors?
The Rhino Farm project, it's a new venture, new concept that Resource Africa has came up with, where communities are given rhinos to farm.
They have the opportunity to transform their livelihoods by a complete quantum jump. You know, we're talking of millions of dollars that are at stake here, and that would provide the incentives for ongoing, not just making a few communities rich, but spreading this across the landscape as a form of land use that could bring much higher values to land and the production from land. It's a land use that can take place under the marginal conditions which characterize so much of Southern Africa.
Currently, our communities are very, very fertile grounds for poaching recruitment. If we changed that round and gave the communities rhinos to farm with and gave them the proceeds of the horns, those communities would suddenly become conservatives of rhinos. They would look after those rhinos just like they would look after the hen that lays the golden egg.
It's absolutely important that this stakeholder, who you cannot expect not to be on the side of the poachers, given the monies that they are given for their effort, they must be neutralized, they must be brought round, they must use their resourcefulness to protect the rhino rather than to abet their killing. And that means making them a meaningful stakeholder, both by government and the private sector.
So where we are standing now, it is our land that was taken by the Kruger National Park some years ago. But at the moment they are no more using it. They fenced the land where the railway is going, then this portion stayed outside the border. We can't use it because they call it a state land under Sandpark.
Our role as Resource Africa is to bring together different stakeholders, bringing the community together, bringing the government together, and Sandparks.
We were at a meeting with Resources Africa, DA, as well as representative of Sandpark. They are willing to help us by providing rhinos to us. If we can get this land, we can fence a big site where we can keep rhinos. By keeping that rhinos, we can be able to cut the horns and sell it legally and help our people.
If we wanted to set up a community and teach them to farm with 40 rhinos, from 40 rhinos they will produce at least 40 kilos of rhino horn a year. Let's say $20,000 a kilo. That's $800,000. That's 9 million rand for a South African community.
We can develop our place, we can provide our children, orphans, future generation, and many things. We can improve the schools. Without learning, we can go nowhere.
No one's going to pay the communities indefinitely for looking after rhino and producing horn if there isn't a legal trade to put the stuff into.
I think this project is the ideal project in terms of giving the communities tangible benefits through employment, financial benefits, value of land, things like that, which is what communities really need, and not handouts and not donations. They need to be capacitated and employed.
The beauty of it is that it can be replicated, it can be extended further and further and further. You also have an opportunity for communities to assist the parks in conserving their own rhino, to set up farms on the edges of major national parks through which illegal hunters will find it almost impossible to get through because the communities will be protecting it.
Dehorning a rhino is a relatively small amount of stress in its life. Probably about 10% of the stress of moving a rhino, because you move a rhino, you dart it, you wake it up, you load it into a crate, the crate is craned onto a truck, the truck drives for 10 or 1,000 kilometers, it gets off at the other end with a lot of clanging and banging again, and it finds itself away from its friends in a completely strange place. With dehorning, yes, we dart it, it goes down. The procedure takes us between 15 and 20 minutes. We dehorn the rhino, it is not hurt at all, it is cut on the part of the horn that's no longer attached to blood vessels, like the tip of your nail. So we cut it off like that, the rhino wakes up, it looks around, almost invariably its friend is still waiting for it, it trots over and it's back at home, back in a normal life. So it's a very, very small inconvenience to the rhino. People who say that it alters their mating behavior, their breeding, are talking absolute rubbish. I have all the proof here. Of course, I'm not talking about the Kruger National Park. There are other factors there. I am talking about a breeding project like my own.
The ban on trade in rhino horn was instituted in 1977. That is about 38 years ago. The intention was to try and save the rhino from extinction. It's clear after this period of time that if anything, the opposite has happened. Year after year, particularly in the last 5 years, 6 years, there has been a serious escalation in the killing of rhino for its horn.
The African continent is dotted with the carcasses of over 100,000 rhino, principally the black rhino. 23 countries no longer have rhino. They've lost their entire populations to the poaching, and you can call it a war, that we are currently faced with. South Africa, the last bastion of substantive population numbers of both black and white rhino, are now at a tipping point. By 2026, if we carry on as we are, there will be no more rhino left in the wild. We've tried every which way to run with more of the same. Better law enforcement. Every private reserve today is run on the basis of a mini army. Anti-poaching staff go out, semi-automatic weapons, bulletproof vests, high-tech operations, and it's still not working. On a daily basis, the death toll grows. So what else is left? We must just carry on fighting it out until the last rhino has been shot and killed, as we are seeing to the north of us.
You can't tell us that you must try harder.
If South Africa wanted to protect 20,000 white rhino, distributed as they are in the country, you're looking for a recurrent expenditure of more than $1 billion per annum. The new budget for the DEA in South Africa provides roughly for 3,000 rand per rhino to protect it over a year. The illegal hunter is prepared to pay something like 1 million rand per year to get those rhino, and who's going to win that battle?
Whether we like it or not, there is a demand for rhino horn. We have tried to suppress that demand. We have tried, and we continue through better law enforcement, through education, to achieve a phenomena of demand reduction. However, as long as it remains an illegal product, there will be demand for it. And because it is the illegality behind the product is in fact what, to a large degree, also drives the market.
As soon as the domestic trade was banned in South Africa, because there used to be a thriving domestic trade, you could sell rhino horn amongst South Africans. Of course, none but the very naive would have believed that some of that rhino horn didn't leak out of the country to Asia. But as long as that was going on, there were not large numbers of rhino being illegally hunted. In 2008, that process was stopped and there was an immediate surge in poaching.
So there are two problems with trade bans. The first problem, you're creating this desirable good which is not available to everybody but only available to people with high-level contacts, which could then actually drive up its price on the black market. But the second problem is that trade bans don't do anything to help the custodians of the resources. These are resources that have real value in the marketplace, but the custodians aren't able to capture that value in any way. So if we take a look at the rhino owners in the early 2000s, some of them were selling horn via fake trophy hunts. Some of them were also selling collected stockpiles legally on the South African market, but it was then being exported illegally. But by doing so, they were still receiving money in return for that, which then incentivized them to invest further in rhinos and to protect their animals. Now, once we stopped that from happening, once we banned or closed the loophole that allowed them to be exported as hunting trophies, and once we stopped domestic trade, there was no opportunity for the local custodians to make any money. Now, the only people who could make any money from rhinos are poachers. So what it does, it effectively impoverishes the legal custodians and only benefits criminals. And the benefits to the criminals have been massive. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I estimate the illegal market has made something like 4 billion, somewhere in the region of 4 billion rands, that's 400 million US dollars. All of this money that should have gone back into conservation has actually gone into the pockets of criminals.
I promise you, every time there's a stockpile of ivory rhino horn destroyed, the syndicates just rub their hands and say more money for us, because all it does is it raises the black market price of that product.
We, the private sector, have invested some 1 billion rand in rhino. And I'm talking about animals alone. I'm not talking about land, security, management, nor welfare. And we are being dictated to by members of the animal rights community who say not only must there be a moratorium, but furthermore the dividend that you get from that product, from that species, from that asset, must in fact be destroyed.
We have closed our shop doors, said we will not compete with the illegal traders and the killers of our rhino. We have given them all the business. We've given them all the business. We're sitting on all the legal horn, and we are not using it to stop them poaching our rhino.
I'm deeply concerned that the Western NGOs simply do not understand the gravity of this problem and what they're up against. I'm concerned that they do not understand the nature of the Asian markets. There's all this talk about rhino horn is not used as medicine. Quite frankly, that's irrelevant. Rhino horn and these other products are status goods. They are prestige goods. What they're used for is hardly relevant. The fact is that people are willing to pay extraordinarily high prices for them. So we're dealing with a market that is analogous to markets for other prestige items like cocaine. Now, when I raise this issue of comparisons to the drug war, people say, oh, well, cocaine is addictive, rhino horn is not. That's beside the point. The point is that the price is so high at the moment on markets that the incentives to provide this product are huge. And at such high price levels, any attempts at enforcement will be undermined by corruption. And this is what we've seen. The war on drugs has been waging for years and years. It's sucked up billions of dollars. It has nothing to show for it. And I think we're looking at a very comparable situation here. And I see this whole emergent war on wildlife trade, and I believe it is going to be just as spectacular a failure. It's going to suck up massive amounts of resources. We're going to incarcerate a lot of people. People are going to die. Animals are going to die. And at the end of the day, we're going to have nothing to show for the war on wildlife trade.
As long as you've got trade and you've got information coming in about that trade, you have an opportunity to manage things. The minute you haven't got any trade and everything is illegal, you are living in a world without data and making ill-informed decisions about things.
In order for illegal trade to work, however, it has to be set up the correct way. A lot of suggestions have been made to have a one-off sale, to dump product on the market and flood the market. Those kinds of things are not going to work for very good reasons. The only way to effectively outcompete the illegal market is slowly and methodically over time. You can't do it overnight. The problem with a one-off sale is you don't know when the next batch is going to come onto the market. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. Also, the way the ivory one-off sales were set up by CITES were disastrous.
Since the elephant went on Appendix 1, there have only been 2 sales of ivory, and everything is wrong with these sales. The illegal trader has no incentive to operate sustainably. When you can only obtain a supply of the product once every 9 years, you're going to look for something else in between. Secondly, the value of the ivory coming back to the producer countries, because only a few, under CITES, only a few buyers, 2 buyers, are allowed to attend the auctions are a farce. The 2 buyers can set the price for the ivory amongst themselves.
The buying agencies then, because they didn't know when the next one-off sale was going to happen, they actually sat on the product, drip-fed it to the market at vastly inflated prices. They made all the profits. Those profits aren't going back into conservation, they're going into the pockets of consumer country intermediaries. And then the high-priced product at the other end sends out the signal to the marketplace that this is a valuable, scarce good, and then it encourages more people to come in and compete illegally again. Now, some people have spoken about flooding the market, dumping a large stockpile on the market to disrupt it. Again, this is a very dangerous and risky thing to do, because in all likelihood you will find more clued up speculators in the buying countries who snap up all the product, and then they will sit on it. They'll release it into the market again slowly. It's the same as the one-off sale. They'll make all the profits. So the only sensible way to enter the market is progressively, from period to period, every time adding a little bit more horn, but only adding what you can sustainably supply. If you dump a whole stockpile onto the market, you could initially disrupt it, but the backlash could actually be even worse and even more detrimental.
If one-off sales, auctions or dumping of rhino horn will not work, what is the best trade model? At one end of the spectrum is free trade, and at the other, a regulated cartel selling to strictly vetted buyers. Free trade implies that any seller of legal horn can sell to any potential buyer. This is the most universal system, where the buyer benefits from lower prices through competition amongst the sellers. Because of the nature of the product, rhino horn can be classified as a precious commodity, and as such, it is vital to keep its value as high as possible. The seller must get the best possible price so as to ensure continued investment in the product. Uncontrolled selling of rhino horn would drive down the price and encourage speculation and corruption. A South African government central selling organization, or CSO, working on a commission basis and managed by outsourced skilled traders, would be able to oversee operations on behalf of the various rhino stakeholders.
In the rhino world, the government of South Africa is what De Beers was in the diamond world. De Beers controlled half of the world's mining of rough diamonds. It seems to me that the government of South Africa controls considerably over 50% of the rhino population that is left in the world today. And analogous to what De Beers did in the old days, it was able to look after the world's diamond market because of the considerable stockpile which it could deploy.
South African government is reputed to have about 16 ton in Skukuza, or in Kruger National Park, about 7 ton in KZN, and about 7 ton in all the rest of the government game reserves in South Africa. That's about 30 ton. The private sector has probably got 5 ton.
As long as one controls that stockpile, one actually controls the market. What one does not want to do is to deplete the stock of rhino horn too precipitately, because that is the ultimate strength. It would be known that with that stockpile they can knock the illegitimate traders, i.e. the poachers, out of the business. And that also serves the purpose, of course, of having the poachers starting to question whether they have a viable business.
The biggest cost to the illegal market is actually paying poachers to poach the animals at great risk, and there's a myth that it's relatively inexpensive to do it. It's not. We know that shooters are being paid very substantial amounts of money now. And then the illegal smuggling is also an expensive activity. It's not easy to get whole horns from here to the end user country.
We could sell sustainably somewhere between 6 and 8 ton of rhino horn every single year. 6 to 8 ton of rhino horn is probably about what is being poached now. So we could replace the poaching with sustainably harvested horn, or horn from long dead animals.
One must buy into the concept that one is trying now to ensure a secure and certain supply to the end users. And that would be done by establishing a price which makes it attractive to them to buy, and then actually sticking to that price. The important tool for regulating supply and demand turns out actually to be the stockpile. It's stockpiled together with price.
We don't deny for 1 second that there will still be poaching. Exactly the same as we do not deny for 1 second that there is illegal sale of diamonds, blood diamonds. We know there will be blood horn.
In the case of De Beers CSO, if any client would be guilty of trading in blood diamonds, knowing that they were blood diamonds, then he risked being sanctioned by being taken off what we call the site holder list of De Beers, no longer being able to buy diamonds from De Beers. He would lose all the privileges of a certain and consistent supply of diamonds at well-established prices. The same thing could be made to apply to rhino horn.
We have the ability that if what we propose is not successful, we can at any time we want to reverse the process.
In 1994, we managed to persuade the world community at CITES to authorize us to sell live animals. They balked at the suggestion that we legalize products such as rhino horn. We tried again in 1997 and we lost by 1 vote. 1 single vote was the difference between us by now having a well-established, thriving and lucrative trade in rhino horn than going into this vacuum over the last 15 years where nothing has been achieved on the global level, and the net result is simply appalling. The loss of rhinoceros to poaching in South Africa at the moment is a global tragedy. We worked so hard for so long to bring our rhino back from extinction.
The value of rhino has fallen by about 50%. Those of us who own rhino are spending vast amounts of money trying to protect those animals, in addition to which every time a rhino is poached, it's a direct financial loss. We estimate in terms of range area, we've already lost about 400,000 hectares of land where rhino used to graze, and on a weekly basis, that area in fact is shrinking.
The private sector and the commercial aspect are just holding it together for now, but this will not last if they aren't able to somehow fund their protection and somehow able to stop the illegal market. If we do not follow the legalization approach, the only hope we have of stopping this is demand reduction. And I know that the Western NGOs are very much behind this strategy. I do not share their high levels of optimism. This can work fast enough.
When people talk about demand reduction, which is a very strange economic concept in the first place, I would say, why do we want the value of our wildlife to go down? What we really want is for people to pay not $60,000 but $100,000 for rhino, because what that will do is drive rhino production.
The reason that I am less confident about demand reduction is because I believe the nature of the product is such that it is its illegality, it is its status and prestige that is driving the market, and that is driven by cultural factors. And cultural factors take a long time to change. I don't necessarily think that a few billboard advertisements or public service announcements are going to change this in the same way that a lot of public service announcements haven't, for example, changed the demand for illegal substances like marijuana or in the past. If the market has cultural traction, it'll take a long time to change that. So the question simply is, can demand reduction be effective soon enough to stop the attrition of rhino populations, which is imminent? We know it's going to happen over the next few years. Will demand reduction work that fast? I'm very skeptical.
So to continue on the path of banning trade that we've been on for 40 years is just going to take us more down the path of doom and gloom. And it's simply not going to work.
Nothing else we're looking at gives you a way forward, either increased militarization of poaching or trying to educate a culture of Chinese people that have been using rhino horn for 5,000 years to suddenly believe that their traditions are valueless. That really is a clash of cultures. The only answer is to get trading and start working on the problem.
I really, really do hope that South Africa will, at COP17, be bold enough to ask for legalization of trade in rhino horn.
Competition for resources is an integral part of the law of nature. Actual ecosystems include man and are an intricate web of continual struggle, not a facade of beauty, natural tranquility, or elegant philosophy. The preservationist viewpoint, although deeply and sincerely held, does not take into account the complexities of wildlife conservation in Africa. Militant protectionism is an ideology that has outlived its usefulness. In present-day Africa, it simply does not work. A far more balanced approach is needed, which takes into account both economic factors and the socio-cultural background of the indigenous people. Human rights have to come before animal rights. Misguided emotional rhetoric will do little to secure the future of the rhino, as for the second time in 60 years, the spectra of extinction in the wild looms large. Legal trade in rhino horn has to be implemented as soon as possible. Time is running out as poaching escalates and disinvestment by private rhino owners accelerates. Once the tipping point has been reached, it will be too late. Courage is required. Trust must be placed in the people who live with the wildlife.
Everybody should not be under any illusion that sustainable use of natural resources is something that is new. It is something that is as old as the communities themselves. Communities used to live in harmony with nature.
If we do bring back the element of community ownership, community involvement, you're actually helping people recall their traditional practices and go back to the adoption of traditional values that were always so good, harmonious relationships with wildlife.
Our future generation, they must see rhino alive, not on picture, because the rhino poaching criminals are busy killing the rhinos. So a few years to come, if we are not protecting these rhinos, there will be no rhino at our land.
And this is a message that I do believe that CITES has got to understand. They have it in their power to make it possible for the rhino horn to be sold, and not to do so would, in my opinion, be a fatal move. It could, in fact, ultimately lead to the extinction, and I'm sure that those who are involved in CITES must not want to see the extinction of our rhino. So when it comes to the question as to whether the rhino horn should be sold or not, there is only one answer. It's got to be sold.